On a freezing Tuesday morning, the numbers dropped at precisely 8:30 a.m., and a quiet, profound panic rippled through the upper echelons of the Federal Reserve and the glass office towers of Midtown Manhattan. US retail sales hadn't just dipped. They had suffered their sharpest, most violent contraction in nearly 2 years. For 18 months, the consensus narrative peddled by financial commentators was one of immaculate resilience. We were told the American consumer was indomitable. Wall Street analysts pointed at record-breaking holiday travel and steady credit card data as definitive proof that the public had absorbed the shock of historic inflation without breaking stride. But it was a mathematical mirage. What the spreadsheets intentionally ignored was that this legendary spending wasn't fueled by genuine economic health or rising real wages. It was a desperate, final velocity. The American middle class was burning through the absolute last remaining reserves of pandemic-era savings, drawing down on secondary lines of credit, and leaning heavily on high-interest installment apps just to keep basic necessities on the counter. In January, the fuel ran out entirely. The consumer didn't just slow down. They hit a wall. This isn't a cyclical blip, and it isn't a temporary cooling of an overheated market. This is the opening salvo of a structural rupture. Right now, across every state, a quiet slaughter is taking place along the commercial strips and regional malls that have defined suburban life for generations. Stores that survived global pandemics, supply chain collapses, and decades of shifting demographics are suddenly boarding up their windows, terminating leases, and liquidating decades of inventory over the span of a weekend. The industry calls it rationalization. In reality, it is a managed retreat from an economy that can no longer support them. Here lies the central paradox of this crisis. While corporate stock indices flirt with all-time highs, the physical infrastructure of American commerce is experiencing an unprecedented cascade of failures. The foundational assumption of modern real estate, the belief that the public would always possess a reliable surplus of disposable income to dump into physical storefronts, has expired. The suburban landscape was overbuilt on the promise of endless growth, a geographic trap where thousands of square feet of retail space were constructed for every single citizen. Now, that excessive footprint has turned into a massive liability, but buried within that catastrophic January data is a deeply unsettling anomaly that the major networks refuse to talk about. A specific tier of retail, the discount sector and the bargain havens that historically thrive when the economy tightens, didn't just stall. They collapsed in lockstep with the luxury brands. This completely upends decades of established economic theory. When the financial shockwaves start leveling the very safety nets that low-income families rely on, it means the systemic decay is far more advanced than a standard pullback in consumer confidence. There is a hidden mechanism at play here. A multi-billion-dollar trap laid by private equity firms and leveraged buyouts over a decade ago that is detonating across 12 specific retail giants right now. The empty shelves and darkened storefronts appearing in your neighborhood aren't merely the result of bad managerial decisions or the unstoppable march of e-commerce. They are the predictable, calculated endpoints of a financial system that has run out of accounting tricks to hide its insolvency. To comprehend the true scale of what is unfolding, you have to look past the immediate corporate obituaries and examine the collateral damage. The departure of an anchor tenant creates an immediate, catastrophic vacuum known as a co-tenancy casualty loop. When a massive retail hub goes dark, the foot traffic of the surrounding plaza drops instantly. Within months, the secondary ecosystem, the dry cleaners, the independent diners, the specialty pharmacies that paid premium rent just to exist in that anchor's gravity, finds itself completely starved of customers. They default. The property owners panic. The local municipality sees its property tax base disintegrate overnight, leaving local schools, roads, and emergency services underfunded. What we are analyzing is the map of a broken economic model. The 12 iconic retailers leading this massive retreat are not isolated incidents of corporate failure. They are the loudest warning signs of an exhausted populace that has officially run out of financial runway. The reasons behind each specific liquidation expose the deep structural flaws of an entire system. To fully dissect how American retail arrived at this fracture point, one must look at the structural trap constructed over 40 years of commercial real estate speculation. Between 1970 and 2010, the United States built physical retail space at a rate that far outpaced population growth, eventually reaching approximately 23 square feet of retail space per capita. For comparison, the United Kingdom holds roughly 5 square feet per capita, while Germany maintains less than 3. This vast oversupply of square footage was sustainable only under a highly specific set of economic conditions: cheap capital, low corporate interest rates, and a stable middle class with expanding lines of consumer credit. When those conditions shifted, the geographic and financial foundation of the industry began to crumble. The genesis of the current crisis traces back to specific legal and political decisions made in the late 20th century. Particularly the tax code changes of 1954 and 1981 that incentivized rapid commercial development through accelerated depreciation. Property developers could write off the cost of building new shopping plazas at an unnatural speed, which turned commercial real estate into a massive tax shelter. As a result, strip malls and regional shopping centers were constructed not because consumer demand required them, but because corporate balance sheets needed to offset taxable income. This artificial boom created an unstable layout where thousands of towns across the Midwest and the Sun Belt became entirely dependent on retail tax revenues to fund municipal services. The vulnerability of this overbuilt landscape was weaponized in the early 2000s by the rise of institutional private equity. Leveraged buyouts became the dominant mechanism for restructuring legacy retail chains. In a typical leveraged buyout transaction, an investment group acquires a healthy retail corporation using a small amount of their own capital and borrowing the remaining balance against the assets of the company being purchased. The acquired retailer is then forced to take that debt onto its own balance sheet, requiring massive cash flows just to service the interest payments. This specific financial mechanism directly caused the collapse of Party City. When the company was subjected to a highly leveraged buyout, it was saddled with hundreds of millions of dollars in high-interest debt right as digital alternatives began to scale. By the time consumer behavior shifted toward online marketplaces like Amazon, Party City was legally bound to direct its cash reserves toward debt service rather than investing in digital logistics or modern inventory systems. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time in January 2024 because its underlying operations could no longer generate enough profit to cover both its physical real estate leases and its legacy debt obligations. Over 800 locations were liquidated because the business model possessed no competitive moat against competitors who did not have to maintain expensive large-format physical stores. A parallel structural failure occurred at Bed Bath & Beyond, where corporate leadership committed a fatal operational error by fundamentally altering their inventory and pricing systems between 2019 and 2022. For decades, the retailer relied on an aggressive promotional model built around the distribution of direct mail coupons. This strategy trained millions of consumers to view full retail price as an artificial metric. In 2019, a new management team attempted to phase out these coupons while simultaneously replacing national brands with private label merchandise manufactured specifically for the chain. The decision ignored basic consumer psychology and supply chain realities. Customers arrived at the stores, discovered that familiar household brands had been removed, and refused to buy the unfamiliar, high-margin private label replacements. By the time the company attempted to reverse the strategy in 2022, the drop in foot traffic had caused an irreversible decline in cash flow. The company defaulted on its credit lines, filed for bankruptcy in April 2023, and liquidated all remaining physical stores by the end of that summer, wiping out 14,000 jobs. The physical properties entered a commercial real estate market that was already saturated with vacant mid-box spaces. Causing a sharp decline in regional property values, the economic pressure shifted up the supply chain to off-price, close-out retailers like Tuesday Morning. This chain operated for over 50 years by purchasing excess inventory from major manufacturers at deep discounts and selling it through secondary strip malls. However, the post-pandemic supply chain crisis disrupted this specific pipeline. Major brands deployed advanced algorithmic inventory management software, to precisely match production with consumer demand, which sharply reduced the volume of excess merchandise available for closeout networks. Tuesday Morning found itself unable to source high-quality product at prices that could justify the operational overhead of its real estate portfolio. The company filed for bankruptcy in February 2023 and completed a total liquidation of its remaining footprint by mid-2023, proving that the treasure hunt model cannot survive when global supply chains operate with absolute digital efficiency. This systemic contraction eventually reached the largest format in suburban commerce, the regional department store. Macy's announced a massive restructuring plan in early 2024 to close 150 full-scale department stores over 3 years, shifting its capital focus towards smaller, off-mall concepts and luxury divisions like Bloomingdale's. The historical connection here is critical. The American regional shopping mall was structurally designed around the concept of anchor tenants. Under standard commercial lease agreements, small inline retailers pay premium rent because the department store at the end of the corridor guarantees a reliable flow of pedestrian traffic. When an anchor like Macy's closes a location, it triggers co-tenancy clauses in the leases of the surrounding smaller stores. These clauses legally allow the smaller tenants to either demand immediate rent reductions or break their leases entirely. Consequently, the closure of a single department store does not just leave an empty building, it destabilizes the entire financial structure of the property. By 2026, the execution of this closure program has left dozens of regional malls across secondary and tertiary American markets in a state of terminal decline, demonstrating that the codependent relationship between department stores and real estate developers has transformed into a mutual economic liability. The commercial distress spreading through the retail landscape has moved beyond traditional department stores, directly impacting core community infrastructure such as pharmacies and discount general merchandise networks. This phase of the contraction represents a direct clash between corporate restructuring mandates and the physical requirements of local populations. The operational adjustments occurring within Rite Aid, Big Lots, Foot Locker, and CVS Health demonstrate that underperforming physical locations are being eliminated regardless of the geographic or social isolation left in their wake. The bankruptcy of Rite Aid serves as a clear example of this escalation. The corporation filed for Chapter 11 protection in October 2023, carrying a total debt load exceeding $3.3 billion. This insolvency was driven by 3 distinct pressures: severe structural competition from larger pharmacy networks, declining reimbursement rates for prescription medications managed by third-party pharmacy benefit managers, and massive legal liabilities stemming from state and federal opioid litigation settlements. Throughout 2024, 2025, and continuing into 2026, the company executed a series of aggressive store liquidations that dismantled its presence in hundreds of communities. The closure of these pharmacies created immediate healthcare deficits, particularly in low-income urban neighborhoods and isolated rural municipalities. In many targeted zip codes, Rite Aid operated as the sole provider of prescription fulfillment, immunizations, and basic over-the-counter medical supplies. Because the underlying economics of these neighborhoods do not meet the minimum profit thresholds required by competing national chains or independent operators, the vacant properties remain unleased, forcing residents without private transportation to travel significant distances to access essential healthcare assets. A parallel breakdown occurred in the discount grocery and furniture sector with the full liquidation of Big Lots. The corporation entered formal bankruptcy proceedings in September 2024 after reporting successive quarters of steep net losses driven by a severe contraction in discretionary spending among lower-income households. Initially, corporate leadership attempted to secure an asset purchase agreement that would preserve a core footprint of several hundred stores. That transaction collapsed when the designated private equity buyers withdrew their bids due to deteriorating macroeconomic indicators. Consequently, Big Lots transitioned into a full wind-down phase, shuttering more than 900 locations across the United States through late 2024 and mid-2025. The failure of Big Lots was accelerated by acute inventory cost inflation. The chain relied on buying surplus closeout merchandise from consumer goods manufacturers at extreme discounts. However, when global logistics costs normalized and manufacturers optimized their output, the availability of low-cost closeout inventory ceased. Big Lots was forced to procure standard merchandise at standard wholesale rates, erasing its historical pricing advantage over Walmart and dollar store networks, which alienated its core cost-sensitive demographic. Simultaneously, specialty retail formats are undergoing a rapid exit from the traditional enclosed mall ecosystem. Foot Locker executed its multi-year lace-up strategic plan, which mandated the closure of approximately 400 mall-based retail locations between 2023 and 2026. This contraction highlights a fundamental shift in retail distribution power. For decades, Foot Locker relied on exclusive product allocations from major athletic brands, particularly Nike, to drive consistent traffic to its mall storefronts. However, Nike and other top-tier manufacturers implemented direct-to-consumer digital strategies, choosing to sell premium product lines through their own websites, applications, and corporate-owned flagship stores. This structural pivot reduced the volume of high-demand inventory allocated to wholesale partners like Foot Locker. Facing diminished inventory exclusivity and declining mall foot traffic, Foot Locker was forced to absorb substantial lease termination penalties to exit non-performing regional malls. Attempting to transition into freestanding suburban strip centers, where operational overhead is significantly lower. This pattern of physical contraction is further illustrated by CVS Health, which finalized its 3-year rationalization program by closing approximately 900 retail pharmacies. Unlike Rite Aid, CVS executed these closures from a position of relative financial stability, using data analytics to eliminate redundant storefronts that were opened during the aggressive market saturation campaigns of the previous decade. In many metropolitan markets, CVS had established competing locations within blocks of one another, assuming that sheer geographic density would block market entry by competitors. When pharmacy operating margins compressed due to rising labor costs for licensed pharmacists and reduced reimbursement caps on generic drugs, this dense real estate network transformed into an expensive liability. The resulting closures have left major urban corridors with significantly fewer healthcare retail access points, sparking intense regulatory scrutiny from state pharmacy boards and local government officials who argue that corporate efficiency strategies are actively creating systemic pharmacy deserts. The operational realities at the ground level across all the chains match the macroeconomic data. The reduction in physical store count is accompanied by a visible thinning of available floor inventory, a reduction in operating hours due to labor optimization software, and an increased reliance on automated self-checkout systems to mitigate rising hourly wages. These cost-cutting measures frequently degrade the in-store consumer experience, accelerating the transition of remaining customers to e-commerce alternatives and creating an ongoing cycle of declining physical sales that forces corporate boards to authorize further rounds of structural closures.